The stranger in the shadows. The city was alive, pulsing with the evening rush as pedestrians flooded the sidewalks, each person lost in their own world. The golden glow of the setting sun cast long shadows over the towering buildings, while the sounds of honking cars, laughter, and hurried footsteps filled the air. Amid the hurried flow of people, one figure stood out, a young boy, dusty and alone, his hand outstretched in quiet desperation. Isaiah was no stranger to the streets. At 14, he had been fending for himself for years, surviving on the margins and learning the rhythms of city life. Dust clung to his face, and his clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, worn and faded. He clutched a crumpled cardboard sign under one arm, his makeshift bed, worn from countless nights on the cold pavement. As he stood near a bustling corner, he whispered his plea, though he had long stopped expecting much. "Please, ma'am, just a few coins," he murmured, his voice hoarse from a day of asking, hoping for a bit of kindness. "I haven't eaten in days." Most people hurried past him, eyes averted, lost in their own lives and oblivious to the boy's plight. A few glanced his way with sympathy, but none stopped. Isaiah had learned to live with the rejection, had trained himself to ignore the sting of dismissive glances and the ache of hunger gnawing at his stomach. But today, for reasons he couldn't quite understand, he felt a heaviness settling in his chest, a weight pressing down on him with every passing second. It was then that he spotted her, a well-dressed woman, clearly wealthy, her clothes shimmering slightly in the fading light. Rings adorned her fingers, glinting as she adjusted her designer handbag. Her face was set in an expression of distaste as she glanced at the people around her. Isaiah felt a spark of hope, a tiny flicker that maybe, just maybe, this woman would spare some kindness. He took a hesitant step forward, his voice soft. "Please, Mom, just a little to eat. I can work. I'll clean your car or carry your bags. Anything." The woman's gaze landed on him, her eyes narrowing as she looked him over. Her lips curled in a look that bordered on disgust, and she took a step back as though he were something dirty and contagious. "Don't touch me," she snapped, her voice cutting through the crowd. "This coat costs more than you'll ever see in your miserable life." Isaiah felt his heart sink, but he didn't look away. He stood his ground, though his hands trembled slightly. "Please, I can work. Just something to eat." The woman scoffed, her eyes filled with disdain as she raised her voice, ensuring that everyone nearby could hear. "Work? Look at you, filthy, stinking, probably crawling with lice. Kids like you don't want to work. You just want to beg and steal from decent folks like me." People around them had begun to stop, drawn by the confrontation. A few pulled out their phones, recording the exchange, while others watched with varying expressions, some indifferent, some pitying, and a few clearly uncomfortable. Isaiah felt his cheeks burn, but he held his head high, refusing to let his humiliation show. His hand instinctively moved to his stomach, which growled loudly, a reminder of the hunger that had become a constant companion. "You don't know me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't know why I'm here, or what I've been through." The woman's glare only sharpened, her tone dripping with derision. "I don't need to know. I know enough to see what you are. A beggar, a thief, probably part of some gang, looking for someone to rob." Isaiah felt her words pierce through him like knives, cutting through the thin defenses he'd built around himself. He blinked rapidly, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he hadn't chosen this life, that he had dreams and hopes once too. But the words wouldn't come. Just as the woman seemed ready to continue her tirade, a deep, steady voice cut through the crowd. "Enough." Isaiah looked up, and a crowd turned to see the source of the voice. A tall man, elegantly dressed in a tailored suit, stepped forward. His face was calm but intense, his eyes focused on the woman with a look that made her falter. Her confident demeanor wavered, and she fumbled, clearly flustered by the stranger's interruption. "I was just trying to teach him a lesson," she stammered, her tone defensive. These beggars need to know their place. The man ignored her protests, walking toward Isaiah. As he approached, his gaze softened, taking in the boy's tired eyes, the dust on his cheeks, and the thinness of his frame. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded bill, and placed it gently in Isaiah's hand. Isaiah's eyes widened as he looked down at the money. It was more than he'd ever held at once, a small fortune in his world. He looked up at the man, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." The man nodded, glancing back at the woman with a piercing look that silenced her. "Today," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you've shown everyone here who you really are." Without waiting for her response, the man turned back to Isaiah, a small, kind smile playing on his lips. "Take care of yourself, young man," he murmured before disappearing into the crowd, leaving Isaiah clutching the bill tightly in his hand. As Isaiah watched the man walk away, something shifted within him. A small flicker of hope ignited, a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. That night, as he found a quiet spot beneath a bridge to sleep, he held the bill close to his chest, feeling a mixture of fear, hope, and anticipation. The man's kindness had stirred something in him, a spark that whispered of possibilities he had long since stopped believing in. The next morning, as dawn broke over the city, Isaiah woke with a sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he thought about something other than mere survival. He felt the stirrings of a plan, a desire to build a better life, though he didn't yet know how. Later that day, Isaiah walked through the streets, clutching the bill tightly. He passed by a bakery where the smell of fresh bread filled the air, making his stomach rumble with hunger. He approached the door, his mouth watering at the thought of a warm meal. But just as he was about to step inside, a voice hissed from behind him. "Don't even think about it." Isaiah turned, spotting a girl about his age, wrapped in a torn coat, her expression wary. Her face was thin, with sharp eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. "Who are you?" Isaiah asked, taken aback. The girl crossed her arms, giving him a once-over. "Name's Tasha, and if you know what's good for you, you'll stay away from places like this." Isaiah frowned, confusion and frustration bubbling up. "I just wanted to buy something to eat." Tasha scoffed, her tone laced with bitterness. "Not here, you won't. These fancy places call the cops the second they see someone like us. Trust me." Isaiah's face burned with embarrassment, but he could see the truth in Tasha's words. He hadn't thought about how people might react to him entering a bakery, especially looking the way he did. He lowered his eyes, clutching the bill even tighter. Tasha's gaze softened slightly as she gestured down the street. "Come on. There's a food cart a few blocks away where they won't look twice at you." With a hesitant nod, Isaiah followed her through narrow alleyways, their footsteps echoing off the walls. They reached a small, quiet part of town where a vendor was serving sandwiches from a cart. Isaiah ordered one, and he and Tasha found a nearby fountain to sit by as they ate in silence. Between bites, Isaiah glanced over at her, curiosity getting the better of him. "Why'd you help me?" Tasha shrugged, chewing thoughtfully. "Someone helped me once. Figured I'd pay it forward. But don't get used to it. Out here, people smile at you one minute and take everything you've got the next." Isaiah absorbed her words, feeling the weight of them settle in his chest. "What should I do then?" She looked him in the eye, her gaze intense. "You make a plan. Get smart, lay low, and find a way off these streets." Isaiah nodded slowly, feeling a strange sense of resolve filling him. He didn't know where this new path would lead, but for the first time, he felt he wasn't alone. And with the memory of the man's kindness still fresh in his mind, Isaiah clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, he was destined for something more. Seeds of a plan. Days had passed since Isaiah's chance encounter with the stranger who had shown him kindness, and though life on the streets continued as harshly as ever, something within him had shifted. That man's words and the warmth in his eyes had planted a tiny seed in Isaiah's heart, a spark of hope that whispered of a better future. For the first time, Isaiah wasn't just surviving. He was dreaming, however cautiously, of a life beyond the cold streets and callous faces. Isaiah continued to meet up with Tasha, the street-smart girl who had become an unlikely friend and guide. They shared meager meals scavenged from the city's hidden corners, places where shopkeepers weren't quick to kick them out. She taught him the tricks of surviving on the streets, and in turn he shared with her his ideas for escaping this life. A life that, despite her tough exterior, Tasha admitted she had grown weary of too. One afternoon, as they wandered through the park, Isaiah pulled out the crumpled bill the stranger had given him. He hadn't spent it yet, treating it almost like a relic, a symbol of a kindness he wanted to keep close. "You still holding on to that?" Tasha asked, her eyes narrowing as she studied the bill. "Why don't you just use it for food or find a cheap place to stay for the night?" Isaiah shook his head, clutching the bill tightly. "It's not just money," he said softly. "It's a promise. A reminder that someone out there thinks I'm worth something." Tasha rolled her eyes, though her expression softened. "Look, Isaiah, out here, you can't cling to things like that. Sentiment gets you nowhere. The only thing that matters is surviving." Isaiah nodded, understanding her words but unwilling to let go of the small piece of hope that Bill represented. He turned to her with a sudden determination. "I'm not going to stay on these streets forever, Tasha. I want to build a life. I don't know how yet, but I can't keep living like this." Tasha crossed her arms, an unreadable expression flickering across her face. She studied him for a long moment before sighing. "If you're serious about getting out of here, then you're going to need a plan. A real plan. And it won't be easy." Isaiah nodded, his mind already racing. "I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to work. I just need a chance, an opportunity." Tasha glanced around, her gaze hardening as if bracing herself for something difficult. "All right, Isaiah. I'll help you, but only because I don't want to be stuck here forever either. We'll need to find a way to make money. Something steady. Something people won't question." Isaiah's eyes brightened with excitement, the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. But before he could respond, a well-dressed man in a tailored suit walked past them, his pace brisk and purposeful. The sight of the man, his air of authority and wealth, made Isaiah pause. He recognized him immediately. It was the stranger who had given him the money, the man whose kindness had reignited his hope. The man was alone, and he seemed to be lost in thought, unaware of the two young people watching him from the shadows of the park. Isaiah's heart raced as he considered approaching him, just to thank him properly. But as he took a step forward, Tasha grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice filled with urgency. "It's him," Isaiah whispered, glancing at her. "The man who helped me. I wanted to thank him." Tasha's eyes darted between Isaiah and the man, her gaze calculating. "Look, Isaiah, if this guy's really as rich as he looks, he might be worth more than just a thank you." Isaiah frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean?" Tasha let out a small sigh, as if disappointed that he hadn't caught on. "People like him, they throw away more money than we'll ever see. If we're smart, maybe we can get more than just some pocket change." Isaiah felt a pang of unease at her suggestion. He didn't want to manipulate or trick the man who had shown him kindness. The memory of the stranger's kindness felt sacred to him, something he didn't want to taint. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the reality of his situation, nor the desperation that gnawed at him with every hungry night. Just then, the man stopped, glancing down at his watch before changing direction, heading toward a nearby cafe. He disappeared through the glass doors, leaving Isaiah and Tasha standing in his wake, caught between opportunity and moral hesitation. Isaiah's resolve wavered, but Tasha's voice pulled him back. "Listen, we don't have to do anything shady. Let's just see where he's going, see if there's an opportunity. If he's willing to help you, maybe he'd be willing to help again." Reluctantly, Isaiah nodded, allowing Tasha to lead him across the street. They positioned themselves outside the cafe, peering through the large glass windows as the man took a seat by the window. A waitress approached him, bringing him a cup of coffee, and he began reading something on his phone, seemingly lost in thought. Minutes passed, and Isaiah's discomfort grew as he watched the man sip his coffee, his attention focused on his screen. Just as he was about to suggest they leave, a woman walked into the cafe. She was strikingly beautiful, with an aura of sophistication and elegance, dressed in a sleek red dress that hugged her figure. But her expression was icy, and as she approached the man, there was a hardness in her eyes that made Isaiah uneasy. "Is that his wife?" Tasha whispered, her gaze narrowing as she watched the woman sit down across from the man. Isaiah shrugged, though he felt an odd tension in the air. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he watched as the woman leaned forward, her face set in an expression of barely contained anger. Her lips moved rapidly, her hands gesturing as if she were making a point, while the man listened with a look of quiet resignation. It was clear that the conversation wasn't a friendly one. The man's expression darkened as the woman continued to speak, her tone sharp and unyielding. She reached into her purse, pulling out a small glass vial filled with a clear liquid, which she held up briefly before tucking it back inside. The man's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he spoke in a low, controlled voice. Isaiah felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the tension in their interaction. He looked at Tasha, who was watching intently, her eyes wide with suspicion. "What do you think that was about?" he whispered, feeling a sense of dread creeping over him. Tasha shook her head, her gaze still fixed on the pair inside the cafe. "I don't know, but something about her. It doesn't sit right with me. Did you see that vial she pulled out? That wasn't perfume." Isaiah nodded, his unease growing. The woman's expression, the way she held the vial, the look of warning in her eyes, it all seemed wrong, threatening. He remembered the man's kindness and felt a surge of protectiveness, an irrational urge to do something, though he wasn't sure what. After a few minutes, the woman abruptly stood, giving the man one final, cold look before striding out of the cafe. She passed by Isaiah and Tasha without a second glance, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she disappeared down the street. Inside, the man sat alone, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn with a look of sorrow. Isaiah hesitated, unsure whether to approach him, but Tasha nudged him forward. "This is your chance, Isaiah," she whispered. "Go talk to him. Thank him, like you wanted. Maybe he'll give us a clue about what's going on." Isaiah took a deep breath, mustering his courage as he stepped through the doors of the cafe. The man looked up as he approached, his eyes tired but kind, and Isaiah could see the glimmer of recognition in his gaze. You're the boy from the other day," the man said, his voice soft but surprised. Isaiah nodded, his hands clasped nervously. "I wanted to thank you, sir, for helping me. It meant a lot." The man's face softened, a faint smile breaking through his weariness. "It was nothing. I saw you needed help." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the man's troubles hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Isaiah couldn't hold back his concern any longer. "Sir, I don't mean to intrude, but that woman who just left, she didn't seem very friendly," he ventured carefully. The man's face darkened, his gaze dropping to his coffee. He let out a sigh, as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. "That was my wife," he admitted quietly, bitterness lacing his tone. "And you're right. Things haven't been friendly between us for a long time." Isaiah swallowed, unsure of what to say. He had seen plenty of bitterness and resentment on the streets, but nothing quite like this. A strange, almost dangerous aura lingered around the man, as if he were caught in something far deeper and darker than Isaiah could comprehend. But Isaiah couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut, the warning Tasha had given him about the woman and the vial. As he watched the man take another sip of his coffee, a thought struck him. Wild, irrational, but undeniable. "Sir, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I know this sounds crazy, but please don't eat or drink anything from her. I think she might be trying to hurt you." The man looked up, startled, his eyes widening as he searched Isaiah's face. In that moment, the quiet cafe seemed to close in around them, and Isaiah felt the weight of his words hanging in the air. The warning. The man's face changed, going from surprise to confusion, and then to a quiet but unmistakable alarm. He set his coffee cup down slowly, his fingers lingering on the rim as he absorbed Isaiah's words. "Why? Why would you say something like that?" he asked, his voice barely audible, yet tinged with a tremor that betrayed more than just curiosity. He looked around, as though someone might be listening, his gaze flickering back to Isaiah with a mix of disbelief and concern. "Do you know something I don't?" Isaiah hesitated, glancing back at Tasha, who stood outside, peering through the glass door with a worried expression. He was aware that what he was about to say might sound absurd, but he also knew he couldn't ignore the strange feeling twisting in his gut. The sight of that vial in the woman's hand, the cold look in her eyes, it all felt wrong, as if he'd stumbled upon something dangerous and unspoken. I don't know for sure," Isaiah stammered, his voice low. "But I saw her with a vial." She pulled it out of her bag, looked at it, then put it back like it was something important. "And the way she looked at you, it wasn't like how a wife should look at her husband." The man's jaw tightened, and he let out a slow, controlled breath, his gaze becoming distant. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap, and regarded Isaiah with a look that was both contemplative and wary. It was clear that something Isaiah had said struck a nerve. "Her name is Amelia," the man said after a moment, as though speaking to himself. "My wife. We've been married for 15 years. He paused, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Or rather, we've endured each other for 15 years. Lately, though, it's been different. Things have been tense, more so than usual. She's been distant, cold, and I felt that there's something else going on." Isaiah's heart pounded as he listened, feeling both guilty for prying and compelled to know more. He hadn't meant to intrude on the man's private life, but he couldn't shake the sense that he had a role to play in whatever was unfolding here. "Why are you telling me this?" Isaiah asked, his voice hesitant but curious. The man met his gaze, his eyes tired and resigned. "Because, for some reason, I believe you. I don't know why, but something about you feels honest." He took another breath, his voice steadier now. "You remind me of someone I once knew, a boy with that same fire in his eyes, who didn't have much but knew how to survive." Isaiah didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to adults seeing him as anything other than a nuisance, a stain on the city streets. But this man, Simon, as he introduced himself, seemed to look past the grime and worn clothes, seeing a person who mattered. For the first time, Isaiah felt like he had a voice, one that was being heard. As Simon leaned forward, his voice dropped to a near whisper. "You're saying that Amelia, my wife, may be trying to harm me, poison me?" Isaiah nodded, a knot of worry twisting in his stomach. "I don't know for sure. But please, just be careful. If there's even a chance that she means you harm, you shouldn't take any risks." Simon nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he seemed to piece together fragments of a puzzle. He glanced at his coffee cup, and for a brief, chilling moment, Isaiah thought he might actually pick it up again, as if testing the boy's theory. But then he pushed it away, a silent acknowledgement of the warning. "Thank you," Simon murmured, his voice a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you for caring enough to say something, even when it wasn't your place. That takes courage." Isaiah felt a strange warmth in his chest, pride mingling with relief. He hadn't done much, yet he sensed that he had somehow altered the course of this man's life, steering him away from potential danger. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that there was more lurking beneath the surface of Simon's troubled marriage. Before Isaiah could respond, Tasha slipped into the cafe, her gaze darting between him and Simon with a look of urgency. "Isaiah, we should go," she whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "We don't belong here, and people are starting to stare." Isaiah glanced around, noticing for the first time the curious glances from other patrons. He realized they were out of place here. Two scruffy street kids in a cafe that catered to the city's elite. Reluctantly, he nodded, standing up and preparing to leave. But before he could go, Simon reached into his wallet and handed Isaiah a business card, his expression serious. "Take this," he said. "If you ever need anything, food, shelter, help of any kind, call this number. And if you see or hear anything unusual about Amelia, let me know. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Isaiah took the card, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He knew this was a lifeline, a chance to escape the harshness of the streets, but he also understood that he was being drawn into something far more complex and dangerous than he had anticipated. "Thank you, sir," Isaiah murmured, clutching the card as though it were a priceless treasure. Simon offered a faint smile, nodding as he watched the two of them leave. As Isaiah and Tasha walked out of the cafe and into the bustling street, he felt the weight of the card in his pocket, a reminder that his life might be changing in ways he couldn't yet imagine. They walked in silence for a few blocks, the noise of the city fading into the background as Isaiah's mind raced. He was torn between hope and fear, excitement and unease. He had been given an opportunity, one that could lift him out of his circumstances, but it came with a dangerous caveat. He had seen something dark, something that suggested Simon's life was at risk, and he couldn't simply ignore it. "So, what are you going to do with that?" Tasha asked, nodding at the card. Isaiah shrugged, uncertainty settling over him. "I don't know, but I can't just sit by and do nothing." Tasha snorted, shaking her head. "You're going to get yourself in trouble. You know that. Rich people like him, they don't live in our world. Whatever's going on with his wife, it's their business, not ours." "But what if it's something bad?" Isaiah countered, his voice barely a whisper. "What if she's really trying to hurt him? I can't just ignore that. I don't know why, but I feel like I have to help." Tasha sighed, exasperation mingling with reluctant admiration. "Fine, suit yourself, but don't come crying to me if it all goes wrong." As they walked on, Isaiah couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut, a sense that he was meant to intervene, that fate had somehow woven him into this stranger's life for a reason. The streets of the city felt darker, the faces around him more indifferent, yet he felt a strange sense of purpose, a drive to see this through. That night, Isaiah found himself alone in his makeshift shelter under a bridge, staring at Simon's business card, running his thumb over the embossed lettering as he pondered his next move. He couldn't ignore the fact that he had seen something wrong, something that hinted at a hidden danger. The image of Amelia's cold gaze, the way she'd held that vial, haunted him, and he knew he couldn't simply walk away. The next day, Isaiah took a risk. He decided to keep an eye on Simon, hoping to learn more about his life, his wife, and the danger that seemed to lurk around him. Tasha was reluctant to get involved, but she agreed to help him tail Simon from a distance, blending into the city's background as only street kids could. They followed him discreetly, watching as he went about his day, visiting offices, meeting clients, moving through a world of power and privilege that felt miles away from their own lives. Yet every now and then, Simon's demeanor would change. He would glance over his shoulder, his face shadowed with worry, his steps slowing as though he were burdened by an invisible weight. At one point, Isaiah noticed Amelia standing near the entrance of a grand building, watching Simon with a look that was both possessive and venomous. She didn't approach him, but her presence lingered, like a dark cloud shadowing his every move. When Simon finally left, she remained, her gaze fixed on his retreating figure, her expression unreadable but ominous. "What do you think she's planning?" Isaiah whispered to Tasha, his voice laced with unease. Tasha shook her head, her face grim. "Whatever it is, I don't think it's good." People like her don't take risks without reason. If she's trying to hurt him, it's probably over money, power, something big. Isaiah nodded, feeling the gravity of their situation sink in. He was just a kid, an invisible face in the city, yet he had stumbled upon a world of wealth and betrayal, a world where lives were pawns in a game he barely understood. As night fell, Isaiah returned to his shelter, exhausted but determined. He had a decision to make, whether to call Simon, to warn him of what he had seen, or to stay out of it, to let fate run its course. But deep down, he knew he couldn't turn away. He had been given a glimpse into a life that was worth saving, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt compelled to protect it. Clutching the business card in his hand, Isaiah took a deep breath and made his choice. He would call Simon. He would tell him everything he had seen, everything he suspected, and he would do whatever he could to stop whatever dark plans Amelia might have in store. As he dialed the number, his heart pounding, he prepared himself for what was to come, knowing that his life, and perhaps Simon's, would never be the same. Shadows of betrayal. Isaiah's heart raced as he pressed the call button on Simon's business card. He didn't know what he was going to say, or if Simon would even believe him, but he couldn't ignore the chilling feeling in his gut. He had seen something in Amelia's eyes, something venomous and unyielding, and he knew that if he did nothing, he would regret it for the rest of his life. The phone rang once, then twice, and Isaiah was about to hang up when a deep, familiar voice answered. "This is Simon." Isaiah took a shaky breath, his voice barely a whisper. "It's me, Isaiah, the boy from the cafe." There was a moment of silence on the other end, followed by a sound of surprise. "Isaiah, what's going on? Is everything all right?" Isaiah's gaze drifted to the darkened skyline above, and he found his voice steadying as he began. I think something bad is happening. With your wife, Amelia. I saw her today, watching you, following you. I don't know why, but I think she's planning something dangerous. I know it sounds crazy, but I can't ignore it." Simon was quiet, and Isaiah feared he had crossed a line, that the man would hang up, dismissing him as paranoid or intrusive. But to his surprise, Simon's voice returned, softer, almost resigned. "I believe you, Isaiah," he said, each word carrying a heavy weight. "In fact, I think I've known for a while that something was wrong. I just didn't want to admit it." Isaiah felt a surge of relief, but also confusion. "Then, why haven't you done anything? Why are you still around her if you know she's dangerous?" Simon sighed, and for the first time, Isaiah heard the depth of weariness in his voice. "It's complicated. When you've been with someone for as long as I have, it's not easy to just walk away, even if you know you should. Amelia and our marriage has been strained for years. We come from very different worlds, and over time, that gap between us has only grown. She's become possessive, obsessive even, and there's a lot at stake, financially, socially. If I leave her, I risk losing everything I've built. But isn't your life worth more than that?" Isaiah asked, frustration seeping into his tone. "If you know she's trying to hurt you, why would you stay?" There was a pause, and then Simon replied, his voice tinged with a sorrow Isaiah hadn't expected. "Sometimes we cling to things out of fear, fear of change, fear of starting over. Amelia and I have entangled lives. It's not just about love or even companionship, it's about control. She's always been fiercely ambitious, and I think I underestimated how far she'd go to keep what she believes is hers." Isaiah's mind raced as he tried to process Simon's words. He had seen men and women in the streets clinging to fragments of their past, unwilling to let go even when it meant self-destruction. But to hear it from a man as powerful as Simon was a reminder that wealth didn't make one immune to fear or pain. After a moment, Simon spoke again, his tone firmer. "Isaiah, I need your help. I know it's unfair to ask, but I don't have anyone else I can trust right now. Will you keep an eye out? Let me know if you see anything unusual. I'll make sure you're taken care of, I promise. Isaiah hesitated. He was just a kid, a nobody on the streets, barely surviving as it was. But he couldn't turn away from this now. Something deep within him urged him to see this through, to help Simon escape whatever dark fate Amelia had planned. Yes, Isaiah said finally, his voice steady with resolve. I'll help. Just be careful, okay? Thank you, Isaiah, Simon replied, genuine gratitude in his voice. You have no idea how much this means to me. They ended the call, and Isaiah tucked the phone number back into his pocket, feeling both nervous and strangely empowered. He wasn't sure what he'd just agreed to, but he knew he was committed. He would watch over Simon, shadowing him from afar, hoping to catch any signs of danger before it was too late. Over the next few days, Isaiah kept a close eye on Simon and Amelia, blending into the city's background as he watched them move through their separate routines. Simon would often disappear into sleek office buildings, meeting with important-looking clients, while Amelia flitted from one high-end boutique to another, her expression cold and unreadable. Isaiah noticed that Amelia rarely interacted with Simon directly, but her presence seemed to linger, like a shadow that clung to him no matter where he went. There were subtle hints, sideways glances, whispered phone calls, moments when she'd look over her shoulder, as if ensuring no one was watching. She was careful, deliberate, a woman who was used to controlling her world, and Isaiah's sense of unease only grew. One afternoon, as Isaiah trailed her discreetly through the upscale shopping district, he noticed something unusual. Amelia entered a small, dimly lit pharmacy tucked between a jewelry store and a cafe, its neon sign flickering ominously. Isaiah positioned himself outside, watching as she approached the counter and exchanged a few words with the pharmacist. Moments later, the man handed her a small, unmarked bottle, which she quickly slipped into her purse before leaving the store. Isaiah's heart pounded. He didn't know what the bottle contained, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to whatever plan Amelia had in mind. She moved swiftly, disappearing into the crowd, and Isaiah struggled to keep up, his mind racing with possibilities. Later that evening, he met up with Tasha, who had been skeptical of his involvement from the beginning. She crossed her arms, regarding him with a mix of amusement and exasperation. "You really think she's trying to poison him?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "This is some rich people drama. You sure you want to be in the middle of it?" Isaiah frowned, struggling to put his feelings into words. "I don't know for sure, but I can't ignore it. I've seen the way she looks at him, like she wants him gone. And she bought something today. Something. Secret. I don't trust her." Tasha sighed, shaking her head. "All right then. What's your plan, Sherlock? You going to keep following her around until you catch her with a bottle of rat poison?" Isaiah felt a surge of frustration. "I don't have a plan, Tasha. I'm trying to figure this out. I can't explain it, but I feel like I'm supposed to help him. Like this is something I need to do." Tasha's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Just be careful, okay? People like her, they don't play fair. You're walking into a world you don't understand, and she won't hesitate to hurt you if she finds out you're onto her." Isaiah nodded, feeling the weight of her words, but he also knew he couldn't back down. He had been given a glimpse into a life he couldn't ignore, a mystery that demanded to be solved. And though he was just a boy on the streets, he felt a growing sense of purpose, a need to protect Simon from the darkness lurking in his own home. As the days went on, Isaiah's suspicions continued to grow. He watched Amelia's movements carefully, noting every subtle interaction, every glance, every suspicious purchase. She was meticulous, calculating, never leaving a trail that could be easily traced. Yet Isaiah sensed that he was getting closer to uncovering her plan. Then one evening, he saw her slip into a dark, upscale restaurant on the edge of town. He waited outside, hiding in the shadows, watching as she met with a man he didn't recognize, a tall, well-dressed figure with a steely expression. They spoke in hushed tones, leaning close over the table, and Isaiah's blood ran cold as he saw the man pass her an envelope, which she quickly tucked into her purse. Isaiah knew he needed to tell Simon what he'd seen. He didn't know who the man was or what the envelope contained, but he was certain it wasn't innocent. Amelia was up to something dangerous, and time was running out. The next day, Isaiah called Simon, arranging to meet him in a secluded park where they could talk without fear of being overheard. As he waited by the fountain, his nerves grew, a gnawing sense of dread tightening in his stomach. Finally, Simon arrived, his face tense and weary, as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Isaiah recounted everything he had seen: the pharmacy, the bottle, the mysterious man at the restaurant, and watched as Simon's face grew pale, his hands clenching into fists. "I didn't want to believe it," Simon murmured, his voice barely audible. "I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. But you've seen it too. She really means to go through with it." Isaiah nodded, feeling the surge of fear and determination. "You need to get out, Simon. Leave, go somewhere safe. If you stay, I don't think she'll stop until she gets what she wants." Simon looked down, his face a mask of sorrow and resignation. "It's not that simple, Isaiah. There are legal matters, assets, and if I disappear, she'll take everything. I'll lose my entire life's work." Isaiah reached out, his voice filled with urgency. "But isn't your life worth more than that? You can start over, rebuild. You have the resources, Simon. Don't let her control you like this." For a moment, Simon's eyes softened, and Isaiah saw a glimpse of the man who had shown him kindness, who had reached out to a stranger on the streets and offered hope. Slowly, he nodded, a spark of resolve igniting in his gaze. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've let fear control me for too long. I'll make arrangements, start moving things quietly. But if Amelia finds out, if she suspects anything—" He trailed off, and Isaiah felt a chill run down his spine. They were treading in dangerous waters, challenging a woman who seemed capable of anything. But they had made their choice, and there was no turning back now. As they parted ways, Isaiah felt the weight of his decision settle over him. He was no longer just a bystander. He was part of Simon's fight for survival, a silent protector in the shadows. And as he watched Simon disappear into the city's maze of lights, he prayed that he would be strong enough to see this battle through, to help Simon escape the web of betrayal that threatened to consume him. But deep down, Isaiah knew that the road ahead was dark and uncertain. Amelia was dangerous, cunning, and relentless, and they were only beginning to understand the depths of her ambition. Unraveling the trap. Isaiah's heart was pounding as he made his way back to his usual spot under the bridge. The past few days had been a blur of secrets and silent dread, as he and Simon quietly prepared for what was beginning to feel like an inevitable showdown. Isaiah knew they were walking a razor's edge, and with each passing day, he felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on grow heavier. After his last meeting with Simon, Isaiah couldn't sleep. He lay awake on his makeshift bed, staring up at the stars that peeked through the cracks above, wondering how he, a homeless kid with nothing but the clothes on his back, had become entangled in a web of deceit and betrayal so deep that it felt like something out of a nightmare. But he also knew that he couldn't turn back now. Simon's life was in danger, and Isaiah was perhaps the only one who could help him escape Amelia's deadly grip. The next morning, as the city came alive around him, Isaiah knew he had to stay vigilant. He was wary of Amelia, fearful that her keen instincts might lead her to suspect that Simon was planning something. After all, she was a woman who had built her life on control, on the ability to anticipate and manipulate. He doubted she would simply let Simon slip out of her grasp without a fight. As Isaiah roamed the city, he kept an eye on Simon's apartment building, watching from afar to ensure Amelia wasn't lurking around or setting any traps. He had begun to understand the patterns of her movements, the places she frequented, the people she met, the subtle but deliberate way she inserted herself into Simon's life, tightening her grip while remaining just out of sight. She was a master of subtlety, leaving no obvious clues, but Isaiah could see her hand in everything. Then, one afternoon, something happened that made his blood run cold. Isaiah was watching from across the street as Amelia arrived at Simon's apartment, dressed in her usual immaculate style, a carefully composed smile on her face. She moved with a calm confidence, her gaze scanning the area in a way that made Isaiah instinctively step back into the shadows. He knew she hadn't seen him. He was too far away and hidden by the crowd. But the way she looked around suggested she was growing suspicious. A few minutes later, she emerged from the building, her face tight with a barely concealed fury. In her hand, she held a folded piece of paper, which she crumpled as she strode toward her car. Isaiah squinted, trying to see what it was, and caught a brief glimpse of Simon's familiar handwriting on the edge of the paper before she stuffed it into her bag and drove off. Isaiah's mind raced. Had she found something incriminating? Had Simon's plans to leave been discovered? Panic surged through him as he realized that if Amelia had any inkling of what they were planning, she would likely act swiftly, without mercy. He needed to warn Simon. Isaiah sprinted to the payphone near the corner and dialed Simon's number, praying that he would answer quickly. The phone rang several times before Simon picked up, his voice strained. "Hello. It's me, Isaiah," he whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "She knows. I don't know how, but I think Amelia found something. She was in your apartment, and she looked furious. You have to be careful. You have to get out now." There was a pause on the other end, and Isaiah could almost hear Simon's mind racing as he processed the information. "Are you sure?" "Yes. I saw her myself. She found a note, something you wrote. She looked like she was ready to tear the place apart." Simon let out a slow, controlled breath. "All right. I'll move faster. I have a safe house outside the city. I'll make arrangements to leave by tomorrow." Isaiah felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. He knew that Amelia wouldn't sit idly by. She would act fast, perhaps faster than they anticipated. And if she suspected that Simon was slipping from her control, she would be ruthless. The following day, Isaiah and Tasha stayed close to Simon's apartment, watching for any sign of Amelia. They huddled in a small alley, sharing a stale sandwich in silence, their eyes fixed on the building across the street. Isaiah had briefed Tasha on everything, and though she had been reluctant to get involved at first, she had slowly come to realize the gravity of the situation. "You really think she's going to try something?" Tasha asked, her voice low as she leaned against the wall, her eyes darting to every shadow. Isaiah nodded grimly. "I know she is. I can feel it. People like her, they don't just let go. They don't accept defeat. She's going to try and stop him, one way or another." They waited in tense silence, the hours stretching out like a taut string, ready to snap. But as the evening descended and the streets began to empty, Isaiah noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. A dark car parked across the street, its engine off, its windows tinted so dark that it was impossible to see inside. It hadn't been there earlier, and Isaiah felt a strange certainty that it wasn't a coincidence. "Tasha," he whispered, nudging her. "Do you see that car?" She nodded, her face growing pale. "You think it's her?" Isaiah swallowed, feeling the tension rise. "I don't know, but I'm not taking any chances." They waited, their bodies pressed against the cold, rough wall of the alley, hearts pounding as they watched the car with bated breath. Then, after what felt like an eternity, they saw movement, a figure slipping out of the driver's seat, dressed in dark clothing, moving with a deadly precision toward Simon's building. Isaiah's pulse raced. It wasn't Amelia. This person moved with a cold professionalism, the kind that suggested he wasn't there for a friendly visit. Isaiah's stomach twisted as he realized this was no ordinary confrontation. Amelia had hired someone, a professional. She was sending someone to deal with Simon, to ensure he wouldn't get away. "We have to warn him," Isaiah whispered, barely able to contain his panic. Tasha grabbed his arm, her voice fierce. "Are you crazy? That guy's a killer. If he sees us—" "I don't care," Isaiah replied, his voice laced with determination. "I'm not letting Simon get hurt because I was too afraid to act." Without waiting for her response, Isaiah bolted from the alley, sprinting toward the entrance of Simon's building. He knew the layout well enough by now, having mapped out the stairwells and hallways on his earlier watches. His feet pounded against the steps as he climbed, his breath coming in short gasps as he pushed himself faster, desperate to reach Simon before it was too late. Bursting onto Simon's floor, he raced down the hallway and pounded on the door. "Simon, it's Isaiah. Open up. You're in danger." There was a moment of silence. Then the door swung open, and Simon appeared, his face lined with fear and confusion. "Isaiah, what are you doing here?" "There's someone coming for you," Isaiah panted, his voice barely a whisper. "Amelia sent him. You have to leave. Now." Simon's face paled, and he glanced down the hallway, his mind clearly racing. "All right. I'll grab what I need, and we'll go out the back." But before they could move, a heavy, deliberate set of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Isaiah's heart dropped as he saw the dark figure approaching, his face obscured by shadows, but his intent clear in his rigid stance, his gloved hands hidden within his coat. "Run," Simon whispered, pushing Isaiah back into the apartment. They scrambled toward the fire escape, their footsteps muffled against the carpeted floor. Isaiah's heart thundered as he realized how close they were to being cornered, to falling into the very trap they had tried so hard to avoid. They managed to slip onto the fire escape, the cold night air biting into Isaiah's skin as they descended the narrow, rickety steps as quietly as they could. But just as they reached the second floor, they heard a loud crash from above, a door being kicked in, followed by the heavy footsteps of their pursuer. Simon looked at Isaiah, his eyes filled with both fear and regret. "I'm sorry you got involved in this," he murmured. "I never wanted you to be in harm's way." Isaiah shook his head fiercely. "I chose to help you. I don't regret it." They continued their descent, the footsteps above growing louder as the man pursued them. Isaiah's breath came in quick gasps as he pushed himself to move faster, his mind racing as he searched for an escape plan. They reached the ground level, and without hesitation, Isaiah led Simon through the narrow alleyways he knew like the back of his hand, weaving through the maze of the city's forgotten streets. Finally, they found a small abandoned warehouse, its doors creaking as they slipped inside, closing them softly behind them. The air was thick with dust and the smell of rusted metal, and they crouched behind a stack of old crates, holding their breath as they listened for any sign of pursuit. After what felt like hours, the silence settled around them, and Isaiah dared to let out a shaky breath. Simon's shoulders slumped in relief, and he placed a hand on Isaiah's shoulder, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved my life tonight," he whispered. "I don't know how to thank you." Isaiah shook his head, his voice filled with determination. "This isn't over yet. Amelia's still out there, and as long as she thinks you're a threat, she won't stop." Simon nodded, a hardened resolve settling over his features. "Then we'll have to be smarter, stay one step ahead. I have contacts, people who can help us disappear, set up new identities, but it'll take time." Isaiah looked at him, feeling the weight of the journey they were about to undertake. He was just a kid, yet he had somehow found himself at the center of a battle for survival, a war against a woman who wielded power with ruthless precision. As they sat together in the darkness, Isaiah knew that he and Simon had crossed a line, that there was no turning back now. Amelia was a predator, relentless in her pursuit, and they would have to be stronger, smarter, and faster to survive her wrath. But despite the fear, Isaiah felt a strange sense of purpose, a fire igniting within him that he hadn't known existed. He had saved Simon once, and he would do it again, no matter the cost. because in that moment, he understood that this was about more than survival. It was about proving that even the smallest voices could make a difference, that even those cast aside could rise to face the darkness. And as they plotted their next move, Isaiah knew one thing with certainty: they would not go down without a fight. The final stand. The following days were a blur of constant movement and cautious planning. Isaiah and Simon had managed to slip out of the city undetected, using Simon's network of contacts to stay one step ahead of Amelia's reach. They took refuge in a small, isolated cabin nestled in the dense woods miles away from any prying eyes. Here, they were safe, at least for now, hidden from the twisted web Amelia had woven around Simon's life. Isaiah had never been outside the city, and the quiet stillness of the forest felt surreal. Gone were the sounds of car horns and hurried footsteps, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The serenity of the place was in stark contrast to the chaos that had overtaken their lives, and Isaiah found himself both comforted and unsettled by the silence. For Simon, however, the isolation seemed to amplify the gravity of his situation. He spent hours pacing around the cabin, his face drawn and contemplative, lost in thought. Isaiah watched him, sensing the weight of regret and fear that pressed down on Simon's shoulders. He wanted to comfort him, to reassure him that they'd make it through this, but he knew that Simon's battle wasn't just with Amelia, it was with himself. One evening, as they sat around a small fire in the cabin's living room, Simon finally broke the silence. He stared into the flickering flames, his voice low and filled with sorrow. "I was a fool," he murmured, almost to himself. "I thought I could control her. I thought that money and status would be enough to keep her content, to keep her by my side. But Amelia, she's not like other people. She doesn't love. She consumes." Isaiah listened quietly, feeling a strange mixture of sympathy and anger. He had come to see Simon as more than just a wealthy businessman caught in a dangerous marriage. He was a man haunted by his choices, a man who had spent years trapped in a life he no longer recognized. "Why didn't you leave her earlier?" Isaiah asked softly, though he knew it was a question Simon had likely asked himself countless times. Simon sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I suppose at first I was in denial. I didn't want to believe that the woman I married could be so ruthless. And then, as time went on, I felt trapped. She made it clear that she would ruin me if I tried to leave her. I was afraid of losing everything I'd built." "But now you're losing something even more important," Isaiah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your life." Simon nodded, his expression filled with regret. "Yes, I see that now. And it took a stranger, a boy on the streets, to make me realize it." Isaiah felt a pang of humility and determination swell within him. He had been cast aside by society, overlooked and forgotten, yet here he was, helping a man who had once looked down on people like him. It was a strange irony, but one that Isaiah had come to accept. He wasn't just fighting for Simon, he was fighting for himself, for a chance to prove that he mattered. The next morning, they began devising a plan to expose Amelia. It was a dangerous gambit, but Simon was done running. He wanted to confront her, to force her hand in a way that would reveal her true nature to the world. They couldn't keep hiding forever. Eventually, she would track them down, and when she did, they needed to be prepared. Simon contacted a close friend, a lawyer named Nathan, who had known him for years and who he trusted implicitly. Nathan agreed to help, arranging to meet them in a secure location where they could go over the details of their plan. They decided to lure Amelia into a trap, using Simon as bait, and record her attempting to blackmail or threaten him. It was risky, but it was their best shot at gathering the evidence they needed to bring her down. On the day of the meeting, Simon and Isaiah traveled to a discreet office building on the outskirts of town. The place was quiet, nearly empty, and they slipped inside, meeting Nathan in a private conference room. Nathan was a tall, lean man with a calm demeanor, his sharp eyes betraying a fierce intelligence. He listened intently as Simon explained the situation, his expression darkening as the details unfolded. "This is serious, Simon," Nathan said, leaning back in his chair. "If she's really willing to go to such lengths to keep control of you, we need to be prepared for anything. Are you sure about this? If she senses even a hint of deception, she might lash out." Simon nodded, his face set with grim determination. "I know, Nathan. But I can't live my life in fear anymore. I've let her control me for too long. I have to face her, and I have to make sure she can't hurt me, or anyone else, ever again." Isaiah watched the exchange, feeling both anxious and hopeful. This was it, the moment they had been working toward, the final step in a plan that could either save Simon's life or bring disaster upon them all. He clenched his fists, silently vowing that he would do everything in his power to see this through. Later that night, Simon sent a message to Amelia, arranging to meet her at a secluded spot outside the city. He made it sound like a surrender, as though he was ready to give in to her demands and return to their marriage. Isaiah knew that Amelia would sense something off, but her desire for control would likely overpower her caution. She would come, if only to assert her dominance and remind Simon of his place. Isaiah, Simon, and Nathan arrived at the rendezvous point early, setting up hidden cameras and microphones in the shadows of the dimly lit parking lot. They knew Amelia would bring her own form of insurance, a guard or perhaps another hired professional. But they were ready for her. Every detail was carefully planned, every angle covered. As the time of the meeting approached, Isaiah's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He knew that this could go horribly wrong, that Amelia might see through their ruse and lash out. But he also knew that they had come too far to back down now. Finally, a sleek black car pulled up to the edge of the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Amelia stepped out, dressed in a tailored black suit, her expression cold and calculating. She exuded an air of confidence and power, but Isaiah could see the faint glint of suspicion in her eyes as she surveyed the scene. Simon stepped forward, his posture submissive, his face a mask of weariness. "Amelia," he greeted her, his voice subdued. "Thank you for coming." She regarded him with a mixture of disdain and satisfaction, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "So you've finally come to your senses," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Ready to stop this foolishness and return to where you belong." Simon nodded, his shoulders slumping in a show of defeat. "Yes, I realize now that I can't fight you. You were right all along. I just want this to end." Amelia's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Isaiah feared that she might see through the act. But then she smiled, a twisted look of triumph spreading across her face as she stepped closer to him. "Good," she purred, her voice soft and venomous. "You never had a choice, Simon. You belong to me, and you always will. No one else will ever love you. No one else will ever tolerate your weaknesses, your failures." Simon's face hardened, and he glanced down, his hands clenched into fists. "And if I leave?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "If I try to disappear, start a new life?" Amelia laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "Then I'll ruin you, Simon. I'll destroy everything you've ever built, everything you care about. I'll make sure you're left with nothing, just as you deserve." Isaiah held his breath, watching as the words were captured by the hidden microphones. He knew that this was the evidence they needed, the confession that would finally expose her for who she truly was. But then, something unexpected happened. Amelia's eyes flickered over Simon's shoulder, and she spotted the faint glint of a hidden camera peeking out from behind a nearby car. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure rage as she realized the trap that had been set for her. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you can outsmart me?" In an instant, she reached into her purse, pulling out a small silver handgun, her hand steady as she aimed it directly at Simon. Isaiah's heart stopped, his mind racing as he realized how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. "Amelia, don't." Simon pleaded, his voice filled with desperation. "You don't have to do this." But she ignored him, her finger hovering over the trigger, her face twisted with a fury that bordered on madness. Isaiah knew he had to act, that this was his only chance to stop her. Without thinking, he darted forward, grabbing a rock from the ground and hurling it at her with all his strength. The rock struck her wrist, causing her to cry out in pain as the gun fell from her hand and clattered to the pavement. Nathan, who had been hiding nearby, rushed forward, grabbing Amelia's arms and pinning her to the ground as she struggled and spat curses, her face contorted with rage. Isaiah stood there, breathing heavily, his heart pounding as he watched her, his mind reeling from the adrenaline and fear. They had done it. They had finally exposed her. Police cars arrived moments later, the red and blue lights flashing as officers took Amelia into custody. Simon stood beside Isaiah, his face pale but relieved, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder as they watched her being led away in handcuffs. "You saved my life, Isaiah," Simon murmured, his voice filled with gratitude and disbelief. "I don't know how to thank you." Isaiah looked up at him, feeling a strange sense of pride and relief. "You already did," he replied softly. "You showed me that even people like me, people who are invisible, forgotten, we can make a difference." Simon smiled, nodding as he wrapped an arm around Isaiah's shoulders. Together, they watched as the police cars disappeared into the night, taking with them the darkness that had haunted Simon's life for so long. In the days that followed, Simon began the long process of rebuilding his life, freed from Amelia's control. He offered Isaiah a place to stay, a chance to leave the streets behind and start anew. And though Isaiah was hesitant at first, he eventually accepted, realizing that this was his chance to build a life for himself, a life filled with hope and possibility. He had come from nothing, but he had found a purpose, a reason to believe in himself. And as he walked into his new life, he knew that he would carry this lesson with him forever, that even the smallest voices could change the world.